To the extent that the Liberate My State movement, whatever that really is, to the extent that that movement is based on constitutional claims, I wanted to identify three big problems with what I'm calling here the Liberate My State mindset. I use the word mindset advisedly because as I watch and listen some of these protests around the country, I'm at a loss to identify any kind of ideology or any kind of philosophy undergirding what's going on here. What it seems to me mostly to be an airing of grievances, if you remember the old Seinfeld episode. In education circles, we talk a lot about mindset. We've identified two types of mindset, growth mindset and fixed mindset. And fixed mindset is this kind of view of the world that I already know or understand everything I'm going to, and if I don't understand or know something, it's certainly not my fault that I don't know or understand it. I think what I'm calling here the grievance mindset takes that even a step further. It's not just that I won't blame myself, right? Not just for what I don't know and what I don't understand, but for my own circumstances in life, right? I won't blame myself. We go further than that and say, well, I will actively pursue and go out and try to find other groups, people, right, things, to conditions maybe, right, to blame, for my own predicament, my own situation. So the upshot of this kind of grievance mindset is the insistence on the part of the people who are protesting that they have somehow been victimized by the government, right, and that the government has somehow taken away their rights, and often you see reference to constitutional rights as the basis for that claim. I want to make some videos that are very kind of specific about certain constitutional legal issues, but as I always tell students, you start with the general, right? You start with general guiding principles and general propositions, and you get more specific, right, as you go along, right, and apply principles to specific factual situations. And as to this grievance notion, right, that my rights have been violated, I'm not saying talking for myself, I mean demonstrators saying, right, our rights have been violated and trampled on. I've identified three overarching constitutional principles, one of which I've already spoken about in a prior video, but I'll repeat here, that are really problematic if you're going to claim that under the circumstances that have evolved here in the last couple of months, that somehow implicates some gross or grave constitutional violation or violation of rights. The first, as I've mentioned before, is, and you may have heard this, right? This is kind of a common saying that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That is why certain constitutional rights, or any constitutional rights for that matter, are not regarded as absolutes. You know, your exercise of your rights can sometimes cause greater harm, right, than the gravity of the right to begin with. You know, here's another saying, right? Your right to swing your fist ends at my nose, right? You might have a right, if you're standing in the middle of nowhere, if you swing away, right? Go ahead, you know, make a spectacle out of yourself. There's no problem with that. But as soon as you hit somebody, as soon as you cause harm, right? That's where your exercise of your right has now come into question. I want to talk to you about one kind of, it's semi-entertaining case that came out of a court, a federal court in Wisconsin years ago. An outfit called The Progressive, right, which had a publication, wanted to publish this, and they ultimately did publish this because the government eventually gave up on trying to stop them. But they wanted to publish an article called The H-Bomb Secret, How We Got It, Why We're Telling It. And the government claimed that the publication of this would be a grave danger to the national security because it contained things like explanations about how to detonate, right, a hydrogen bomb. In light of that, the government sought an injunction directing the Progressive not to publish that article. Now, again, ultimately the article was published because the government gave up. Why? Because everything that was going to be published in that article eventually leaked out in other outlets around the country, so it all got out anyway. But here's what the district judge said when the district judge actually initially did issue an injunction, right, which means stopped the Progressive from publishing. And of course that's a serious First Amendment problem, right, to stop a publication from publishing something. But this is an illustration of how federal judges tend to treat constitutional rights. Take a look at this quote. Faced with the stark choice between upholding the continued right to life and the right to freedom of the press, that's a First Amendment right, most jurists would have no difficulty in opting for the chance to continue to breathe. Think about that, right, in terms of how judges are going to handle the current situation, right? The right. It's interesting that the judge here used the word breathe, right? Of course, COVID-19 being primarily a respiratory problem. The judge continued, a mistake ruling against the progressive will seriously infringe cherished First Amendment rights. A mistake, on the other hand, in ruling against the United States could pave the way for a thermonuclear annihilation for us all. In that event, our right to life is extinguished and the right to publish becomes moot. So, again, this is one of the better illustrations I've ever found where a court says, yeah, we recognize the gravity and the importance of constitutional rights, particularly the First Amendment, but sometimes those rights have to yield. Here's problem number two. Another element, right, of the grievance that we're hearing is that the government is punishing me or punishing us, right? And if the government's going to lock me up in my home, right, I'm entitled to counsel and a jury trial and or a hearing. You know, this kind of these kinds of claims that right, that the government is doing something to me. Again, this is part of the grievance mindset, right? The government is doing something to me that it can't do without giving me certain due process and whatnot. The problem is that courts don't generally get into this game of how much of a hearing or how much of due process you're entitled to unless there is an individualized deprivation of some liberty or property interest. And the thing about these quarantine orders and stay-at-home orders, whatever you want to call them, is that they're not punitive. They're not being imposed on individuals. That's actually going to be my third point, right? But they're not imposed for punitive reasons. They're not being used to punish. Now, one might argue, well, if I break the curfew, or I break the or if I break the rules, if I go into a large gathering or encourage a large gathering, then I could be arrested. So it is a criminal matter. It is punitive. Well, no. Okay, violating a quarantine requirement, right, might subject you to punitive action from the government, but the quarantine itself is not punitive, right? It's a public health measure, and I don't think you're going to have a lot of federal courts, right, looking at this saying, well, you know, the government's punishing people without giving them due process. The government's not trying to punish anybody, and that's when due process kicks in. So that's a second overarching, right, problem here, again, with this kind of mindset that we're seeing at these protests. When the government does impose quarantines or isolation orders for punitive reasons, we know what that looks like. That looks like the picture on the left here, okay? The picture on the right is sad and tragic. It's terrible. It's too bad. It has to happen. But again, that is not punitive and would not trigger some kind of due process. This is the type of due process you'd expect in some kind of a criminal proceeding where the government is actually trying to punish somebody. A third and final for today and related point is that stay-at-home and social distancing requirements, right, seem even-handed, which is to say they apply to everybody. And again, what we normally see in constitutional cases, and again, these are very general principles, is courts getting all worked up when the government is treating some people one way and other people another way for arbitrary reasons, right? The way courts talk about this is say, well, you're treating similarly situated people in different ways, right? I'm going to talk more about that in future videos, but a stay-at-home order or a social distancing requirement that simply applies to everybody simply does not give rise to these kinds of constitutional concerns that people are being targeted, right, based on who they are or based on the exercise of certain rights. And this is related also to an idea I talked about in a prior video about, right, laws that are generally applicable. So it'd be one thing if the government came to your house for you, right, and said, we're taking you out of your house and putting you in some quarantine, right, camp or something. Now you're talking about a different story. I hope that makes sense, right? Now you are talking about a situation where you'd be entitled to due process. You'd probably be entitled to a lawyer, right, or at least some kind of legal advice. and there'd be some real procedural problems with that. But that's one thing. A general ordinance or a general order that says, listen, we got a public health emergency, everybody stay at home. That's not the government coming for you, right? So your three real overriding problems here with this grievance mindset that's being expressed around the country is, number one, again, the idea that this false notion that constitutional rights are absolutes. They're not, because courts don't regard the Constitution as a suicide pact. The second problem is that, right, this grievance mindset turns what is a public health imposition, certainly it's an imposition, into a perceived punishment, and I don't think federal judges are going to perceive it as a punishment, right, triggering constitutional protections. And the third is that these laws appear to be, at least for the most part, even-handed, right, and so since there's no individualized targeting or arbitrary application of the law, or these requirements, that's another problem in terms of trying to make out some kind of constitutional violation. So that's a big picture presentation there. Again, I'll get more specific hopefully in some videos to come, but I wanted to get this one out there. I'll address some of the questions too I've seen on Facebook about economic rights and business rights too. I'm going to do that in a video pretty soon. So everybody stay well. Thanks for watching this one. Make sure to subscribe and like and all that good stuff, and I'll see you next time.